Portuguese pianist Maria João Pires had misheard the program, and there she found herself at the piano in front of 2,000 people, and the orchestra had already begun. There was a moment of panic as she tried to understand what was happening. She conversed with the conductor to say, "I've prepared the wrong piece." However, the conductor was calm and simply said to her, "You played this last season, you can do it again." She took a moment, took a deep breath, and as that introduction of the orchestra continued, she began to visualize what this piece looked like. As her moment of entry came, her fingers reached for the piano and played a flawless performance. Now, this is an exceptional story of a well-trained procedural system, one that has been established through a focused and deliberate approach to learning. It doesn't always work out this way. Now, as a music educator, I've seen this many times, but from the other angle. That is, where a student is playing confidently, fluently, and engaging the audience into their performance, and then a wrong note, something that disrupts that flow. Suddenly they're looking at the music, trying to find their place, and a very disjointed performance takes place afterwards. It's a struggle, and it's one that happens far too often. The shift is immediate. They've moved from an automatic procedural pathway to a real-time declarative pathway, interpreting information as they go. And this can apply to dancers when there's a gap in the choreography, to an actor when the lines fail to materialize, or even to a presenter when the cue cards are in the wrong order. It causes a stutter, that shift from the procedural to the declarative pathway. And that stutter can happen to inexperienced and experienced practitioners. This phenomenon where the brain's automatic processing is disrupted by conscious thought is well documented in cognitive psychology, much like the distinction between automatic and controlled processes described by researchers like Schneider and Schifrin. And this can happen in other areas as well. Imagine a tennis player who suddenly loses the ability to use a shot, overthinking everything they're doing, resulting in more and more mistakes. This is a clear shift from that procedural pathway, the automaticity that they've spent all that time developing, to the declarative pathway, where they're trying to reason and think their way out of the situation. We often know this as choking, and it's one that can be very common to performers in all areas. The declarative pathway deals with explicit knowledge, facts, concepts, events, and data. This is the knowing what. It is highly flexible and requires conscious recall and active thought. It can be acquired through direct instruction, being learned in a single learning session. It can be quickly forgotten though if it's not rehearsed or revisited. The procedural pathway deals with implicit knowledge, skills, habits, and procedures. This is the knowing how. It is rigid and context specific, largely non-conscious and automatic, and is acquired slowly through repeated practice. It is highly resistant to forgetting. Once a skill is learned, it is retained for a very long time, even without practice. And then there's illusion of fluency, where our declarative knowledge gives us a false sense about what our skills or ability might be. Just because we know things doesn't mean that we're able to do anything with them. This was highlighted by Robert Bjork, and the fact that simply reviewing material doesn't mean that we understand it. The distinction is simple. The declarative pathway is the knowing what, and the procedural pathway is the knowing how. Declarative memory involves readily accessible information, while procedural memory is about the practice it takes to develop the ability to put that information into action. Maria João Pires' extraordinary feat highlights the role of deliberate practice, that time that it takes to develop the procedural pathway into something that you can trust. And if you are going to form that habit, you want to make sure A, it's accurate and it's applicable. And this brings us to the intersection of these two pathways, the declarative and the procedural, alongside deliberate practice, and how you can really utilize this to get those desired outcomes. Deliberate practice, as the name implies, is intentional in its approach to both of these systems. It requires specific goals, intense attention, and focus, the development of robust mental representations, and the ability to gain real-time feedback to make necessary adjustments. For instance, the declarative pathway relies on signals to the brain to tell it that the information is important. That way it is retained. However, isolated facts are not enough. We need to be able to develop the connection simultaneously with the procedural pathway. This means we are better able to work towards that desired outcome. In an example from Uncommon Sense Teaching, it asks you to imagine a paint palette. It contains a range of different isolated colours. We can build connections between these, examining the effect of blending them together, all whilst remaining in the declarative state. Only once we pick up a brush and begin the process of mixing colours do we begin to develop the procedural pathway, the skill itself. The process reduces the load on our working memory, freeing it to focus on other aspects such as the artistry itself. The pathways work in tandem, the declarative more quickly and readily adapting new information, and the procedural taking more time to develop. We can use this example of the paint palette to better understand application in real life. For instance, something like flashcards or cue cards are useful. However, they're not the end of what we're trying to achieve. Therefore, the way that we use them shouldn't be as the isolated facts that they present, but the connections that they represent. This could be using that knowledge in novel situations, creating something new, applying, analysing. Each of these things take those isolated facts to the next level. And if you've ever tried to learn a new language, you'll know that there is a difference between that declarative pathway where you can recognize and understand the meaning of words and the ability to be able to write, to be able to speak, or to be able to converse with someone else. That's where these two things work in tandem. Apps are useful. They can help us to reinforce what it is that we know and maybe even give us a start. However, the key aspects of this come through leaning into that procedural pathway, working in tandem, and developing the skills that you will be able to use in the future. There's also a difference in how the brain processes each of these. Declarative memory leans more heavily on the hippocampus and the neocortex, while the procedural memory connects to the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and the motor cortex. This neurological distinction, deeply explored by researchers like Larry Squire, underpins why these systems function differently. So adding a little bit of extra effort now will reap rewards in the long run. Habits are not formed in 21 days. As the research by Philippa Lally and her colleagues have shown, it actually takes much longer to be able to reinforce through that consistent practice the habits that we would like to integrate into our life. The same is for skills. Taking the time to be consistent over a period of time, the repeated actions with the right feedback and the targeted results means that we'll be able to establish these more firmly. That procedural pathway, once we've got it, we're not going to lose it. The hippocampus needs to continually recall from the neocortex for declarative connections to strengthen, while the basal ganglia acts as a gatekeeper for the procedural pathway, initiating and facilitating particular actions in connection with the motor cortex. The key learning in all of this is understanding that there are these two pathways, the declarative and the procedural. By getting these to work together, that connection will build deeper understanding through being able to take those isolated facts or that knowledge that you have and apply it meaningfully. The key aspect of this though is it takes time. That procedural pathway requires that dedication, that deliberate practice to ensure that it is embedded and is always going to be there for you now and in the future.